Welcome to Life with Beth and Court,
where we teach you how to live authentically and build your best life.
one step at a time.
And we are back. What do we mic check in with?
Well, I thought I'd bring back an 80s band for this one.
Per the usual.
Well, I was actually torn between this and Garth Brooks, but I went down a deep, deep rabbit hole with the Garth Brooks music, and then I just completely lost track of what I was supposed to mic check with for that one. So then I went with this one because it's easy. Ready?
Let's do it.
Blame it on the shame. Yeah, yeah. Do you know what song that is?
I definitely don't.
Blame it on the rain. Yeah, yeah. Milli Vanilli.
I've literally never heard that name.
Wow. I feel sad.
I'm very
for you.
uncultured.
Yeah. When it comes to music, you are.
I mean, to be fair, I was born in 1987.
I was born in 1988, and I still
That's true.
found the best use of my time by learning all of the 80s music.
Listen, I spent my time on Michael Bolton, Celine Dion, Richard Marx, Don Henley, all the people that my mom loved.
Speaking of... No,
My mom?
well, maybe. I was going back to Garth Brooks for a second. So, fun fact, Garth Brooks does not sell any of his music on any of the platforms like Spotify, Pandora, YouTube. If you Google him or look him up on YouTube, you find covers of all of his music. And then I remembered that one time in the apartment where I had this epic meltdown that I couldn't listen to his music.
I do remember that.
And I went through some shady backdoor site that for $67 I had lifetime access to all of his music. Do you remember that?
Yeah, that was before your budgeting was under control.
It really truly was. That is like a very good indicator of what my budgeting skills looked like. But
you were sitting in the living room with something spread out all around you, but I don't know what it was because it very obviously wasn't his music.
I think it was my vision board. I think it was while I was doing the vision board stuff.
That was the same time when you realized that Garth Brooks raised you.
I forgot about that.
How could you forget about it? That was that experience when you were trying to find his music.
We were listening to all of his music that I found for $67.
And where's that music now?
I could not tell you. The website probably got shut down. It was probably like Napster or LiveWire.
He was like, lock that shit up.
I think he actually 2 years ago decided to sell to iTunes. Like I think he officially sold the one platform. Anyway, after listening to all of his music, that's totally where I realized like he shaped my entire life of who I was and who I wanted to be. And I was like crying all over his music.
What a profound moment.
Yeah. I don't think I ever shared that with my mom. She'd either be super proud that she co-raised me with Garth Brooks or be like, what the hell, Courtney Nicole? I raised you. I'm your mom. So
people would be like, Garth Brooks is your dad?
Oh,
No.
He raised me. Garth Brooks raised me. I'm just going to start saying that to people.
Yeah, he raised you through the speakers.
I bet it would get his attention.
I'm pretty sure he's probably heard weirder.
That's true.
All right, so let's kick this thing off. Welcome back to another episode of Life with Beth and Court. I'm Beth.
I'm Court.
And today we're talking about what shame is, how to identify it, and what to do about it. But first, we just got back from a trip from Cali, did we not?
We did. And we took a break from the podcast because we had way too much going on. And it was one of those opportunities that we had to take advantage of. And it was really cute because people reached out to us and said they missed us and they were excited we were coming back.
How sweet.
Super sweet.
Also, we know that people batch their podcasts. We're just not there yet.
We're not.
We'll
We'll be there someday.
But we're being real about where we are, and where we were was Cali bound.
Yeah.
And we didn't have an opportunity to record, especially because we didn't want to cheap out on the topic that we're talking about today because it's super important. And ironically enough, it ties in very closely. Probably not ironic at all. That's probably on purpose. That
Right.
it ties in with our course and setting boundaries and all the feelings that wrap us up tight and keep us from our full potential.
Yeah, keep us in our head a little bit with that horrible voice that tells us we're not good enough.
Exactly that. So first, tell me what your biggest takeaway was from Cali.
Oh my gosh, that we can change lives. Like, I already knew that we could actually change lives, but we have the potential to hit a scale that can reach so many people and help so many people with the things they struggle with. So, I think before we left, in the spirit of being authentic and transparent, I was kind of freaking out a little bit because we've poured our heart and soul into this project. And I am the first one to raise my hand and say I'm a vulnerable person. But I think this is a whole new level of vulnerable, to put your blood, sweat, tears, every extra moment of your time, work out there, and then say, hey guys, you want to pay us for this?
To be clear, no blood was shed in the making of our course, though.
I probably got a paper cut somewhere along the way. But
It's digital.
and it's hard because I so believe in our content and I know it's changing lives. We already know that from the beta group that we ran, that they have really big results, but it's just a really big concept for me to put that out there and just be like, all right, hopefully you guys like this. We worked really hard.
Yeah. And I think what I took away is the power of the company you hold. I mean, the people that we hung out with this weekend, it was just so eye-opening what your life could be.
Yeah.
You know, especially when you think that you're already, I thought we're doing pretty good on setting boundaries and living the life that we want, living a life that feels right for us and being authentic in our choices and what we do with our time and energy and all of that. And then some of the friends we met, we were like, oh, damn.
Yeah.
So
it was a good combination of both, though, because I felt like some of the people, they were coming to us and looking at us as the expert in some things. And then there was also that shift of there were people that were ahead of us in some different ways. So I love that balance of the give and take,
totally.
that we could reach up a little bit to get some things. And there were people coming to us and reaching up. So it was a really good balance.
And just to kind of like learn from everybody's experience, like learning what it looked like for all these new people in our lives, what it looked like for them to live authentically.
Yeah.
Like Victoria and Mike, who are like, F it,
my
let's sell
gosh.
everything and live on a boat.
Yeah.
And by the end of the weekend, me and you were like, well, how do you heat it? And where do you get your internet? Where do
I
the
still
dogs
need
go
to
the
know where the
bathroom?
dogs go to the bathroom.
I mean, yeah, that
That's
is
the one thing
concerning.
I'm hung up on.
Yeah,
Like, do
or-
they just hold them over the edge and they go to the bathroom? Like, how does that work?
I doubt that.
They throw them out there to swim and then they come back?
But like, it's super cool to know that they run an online business and
Yeah.
then they just sail from port to port and live their best life.
Yeah.
Or Julia, who's like, yeah, I travel the world all by myself and it's fun.
Yeah.
And it's
it was
awesome.
so cool to be ingrained in the other cultures of the people we met. And we met some really amazing people that I truly believe will be good friends moving forward.
totally.
So, yeah, it was great.
And that's the whole point, is when you hang out with like-minded people and like-spirited people, that is the company that we want to hold. The people who believe in the possibilities of what this world has to offer, believe in the possibilities that we can make change, that we're change makers, and that the way things have always been isn't the way that they always have to be.
Right.
And so I think that is very liberating too. And when it's just cool to understand all the different things that people teach each other. You know
Yeah.
what I mean? Like, every one of our friends was teaching something different in their courses.
And I think it all comes back to that community piece. So as we really started to get down to the heart of our course and started talking about what really starts to make change and affect people and make that influence, it's the same as the topic we're about to go into today. You need a super strong community, your corner
Yeah.
people, to elevate you to that level and have your back when you start making changes. Because when you start setting boundaries, like we teach you in our course, and you start enforcing boundaries, it gets a little scary. So you've got to have the right people in your corner. And I feel like that's the theme that's just being elevated over and over as we get into these final stages of launching, which is really
Yeah.
cool.
Totally. So, especially with boundary setting, community is absolutely key. And like I said, this is a group that would definitely be our corner people
Yeah.
in having to say no to the things that we need to and say yes to the things that we want to,
For sure.
essentially. So, all right. So let's jump in today. So what is shame? That's what we're going to start with. And how did we come up with this topic?
Well, as we looked at our journey of the things we've had to overcome to be in a place to teach other people about this, I know that I had a ton of shame in my life, and I didn't realize it until probably couple of years ago where I had a moment in my life where I felt shamed to its core, that I was fundamentally flawed, that I was not worth anything. I was not a good person. And I know I talk about this a lot, but I'll go back to it. It was when I left my job at the Y that I lost my sense of identity, and losing that sense of identity just unraveled this horrible, horrible toxic cyclone of all of these things. Like, I don't have a purpose anymore, and no one cares about me because I can't prove my worth, and I'm not good enough. And so for me, I felt like this is one of the hard hitters that was really transformational for me to learn about. So partially that, and then I would say partially because you're obsessed with Brene Brown.
I was just going to say partially because this is going to be a whole episode where I get to fangirl over Brene.
So for me, it came from personal experience on a very deep level. And that experience specifically definitely brought it to a head. Like, that was the most intense experience I had had. But then once I started to look back, shame had been a pattern in my life for a very long time. I just didn't know that's what it was.
Totally. And one of the reasons that we know that now is because of something we talked about on a previous episode, which is shame is highly, highly correlated with perfectionism.
Yeah.
And that is something that you've identified that you struggled with greatly. And shame loves perfectionism.
Well, and it's crazy because as we started, we used two different sources for doing our research for shame. But as we started digging into them, there were a lot of behaviors and a lot of personality traits that correlated with shame. So that's why we're excited to share those with you today. Well, not excited. It might be kind of sad and devastating, but we're excited to bring that level of awareness, because that's the first step, is saying, oh, this is perfectionism, but could this be coming from somewhere else?
Well, and that's one of the things that Brene said. That's going to be my tagline all night long.
What?
Is one of the things that Brene says.
Oh.
Hashtag one of the things Brene says. So that is something that she talks about, is that emotional literacy is the first step in overcoming shame, because we have to learn to identify what our emotions actually are.
Right.
And I know that in part of one of her books, one of her 4 books that I've read, she talked about how I think they've identified 33 human emotions, but the average adult can identify only 3 of them.
Yeah.
And so that is truly powerful in understanding how limited we are in identifying what we're actually going through. And if you can't identify it, how could you possibly move past it?
Well, and it's interesting because one of the seminars we were at in California, he talked about speaking the language. And so I think that relates here, because how can you really connect with someone and communicate how you're feeling and what's going on if you don't have a diverse toolkit of language?
Yeah, and I think that's something, honestly, that you and I have dialed in a lot in the past couple of years.
Yeah.
Both on your side and my side, of just understanding what it is we're feeling.
And that has done wonders for our relationship. Like, when you talk about how to make a healthy relationship, part of it was getting super specific and expanding that toolkit of what we were feeling, how to communicate it, and then adding in a mixture of other components. But I would totally agree that that's something we've dialed in on, and it's made a huge difference.
Well, and some of, one of the emotions that came out most often for me was anger.
Yeah. Which is a
And-
secondary
Right,
emotion.
exactly. So we had to work on, okay, you feel angry right now, but where is that anger coming from, and why are you feeling anger in this moment? So
I just cried a lot and ran away.
You did. No, I ran away.
I ran away sometimes too.
We both had a terrible habit of just you would hear the keys jangle, and that meant one of us was leaving, which is never a
but
good
when
solution.
you go back in time to that situation, it meant that we both felt unbearable pain and frustration that we didn't know how to channel it. And so the easiest solution, I mean, for me, if I'm being real, part of that was probably shame. Like, I felt like I was a bad girlfriend and I couldn't make you happy and I couldn't do right by you. So instead of communicating that with you and facing it, I'm like, I'm going to peace out because this feels horrible and I feel like I'm a bad person.
So let's get down to what shame actually means, because this is a good point that half of the battle is understanding when you're feeling shame versus some of the other emotions that we may feel. So shame is the intensely painful feeling or experience of believing that we are flawed and therefore unworthy of love and belonging. And that last part is very important. Therefore, unworthy of love and belonging. And so that comes from Brene Brown's work, Gifts of Imperfection, and also Dare to Lead. She's got that in there. She's probably has it in every piece of work she has because that's the fundamental of what she studies. So
Think of how heavy that is, unworthy of love and belonging.
Totally.
That's the number one thing we all crave. Maybe not the number one thing, but we
no,
all,
it is. Yeah,
Yeah,
like
we
our,
all have
our most basic need is
right.
social
So
connection.
to feel like you're not worthy of that, what does that leave you with?
A lot of feelings of despair and hopelessness and
Right.
Well, so like the whole idea is that shame is all about fear. It's about fearing that you're unlovable.
Right.
I think the best way that Brene differentiates shame from guilt, for instance, is shame is about who you are,
Right.
and guilt is about what you've done. So shame says I am bad, and guilt says I did a bad thing. And I think it's interesting. She says that guilt comes when we hold up our behaviors, something we did or maybe didn't do, against our values, and they don't match up. And so in that way, guilt is a healthy social construct that can bring about healthy change.
I feel like there's something in between those two, though, because I used to be the one that was like, oh, you effed up. What are you thinking? What's wrong with you? Like, I used to have really, really bad negative self-talk. But now when I make a mistake, I wouldn't necessarily say it's guilt. It might more be embarrassment.
Yeah, and so that's a good point, because there's also humiliation and embarrassment. So the four emotions that she kind of identifies are shame, guilt, humiliation, and embarrassment. And so shame, like we talked about, is I am bad, I am dumb, I am unworthy, I am limited and can't do this or whatever. Guilt is I did something bad or I did something wrong. Humiliation, the difference there is if you feel shame, you think you deserve it. Humiliation, you don't think you deserve it. So say your boss calls you an idiot in front of a whole room full of people. Not helpful, first of all. But if you feel in that moment, man, he's right. I am dumb. I don't even know what I'm doing here. I'm not qualified for this job. That's shame. But humiliation would be, man, he's being a real douchebag. This isn't about me. He's having a moment. I don't deserve that. That's humiliation, because it's a terrible feeling. It's very
Right.
uncomfortable.
But it's not that you're a bad person. It's
Right.
that you're being treated in a way that's not okay.
And you're not believing that message, right?
Right.
So if you believe that message, again, it would be the first part, which is, yeah, he's right. I am an idiot. I am unworthy of love and belonging because I'm
Right.
stupid, right? If you feel humiliation, you're saying, I don't deserve this. I know I'm not stupid. I made a mistake, yes, but I know I'm not stupid. And he's just being awful to me. And then embarrassment, the differentiation there is that when you feel embarrassed, it's fleeting, and eventually it could become laughable, where you say, hey, remember that one time my pants fell down in public?
Right.
That didn't actually happen, by the way. I don't know why I picked that
I've
example.
probably had that happen.
But so embarrassment would be, you know that this has happened to other people.
Right.
Like, you know that you're not alone in this.
It's not something fundamentally wrong with you at your core.
Right.
It's something that happened to you that felt uncomfortable, which is very different.
Exactly. So it is important to identify between those. And just to kind of play off of the literature that you've been reading, because you are reading from a different book than I am as far as shame. Your book identifies, he calls it good shame and toxic shame. And so the ones that we just listed, the humiliation, embarrassment, guilt, he kind of identifies as what he would call good shame. And then the actual shame that Brene talks about, he's identifying that as toxic shame, right?
Right. So just to pause for a second, he is John Bradshaw, and the book I have read and I'm resourcing is Healing the Shame That Binds You, which is very psychology based, like id, ego, super ego. It's pretty wordy. And so it's just interesting because I was reading from that and Beth was reading from Brene. So to continue on what he said, said, he talks about how there's this whole evolution or continuum of healthy shame that's natural, that just develops over time as we progress and get older.
Well, and to talk about natural, right? So Brene talks about the shame 1, 2, 3s, the shame 101. And those three things are we all have it, that it's
Yep.
universal and one of the most primitive human emotions that we experience, and that the only people who don't experience shame are those who lack the ability to have empathy or human connection, which is a what?
Sociopath.
Yeah.
Sorry, I so zoned out for a second.
The second thing she lists is that we're all afraid to talk about it. And the third thing is the less that we talk about shame, the more control it has in our life.
Do you remember when I thought I was a sociopath?
I do.
I was watching Sherlock, and they called Sherlock a sociopath, and then I thought I was a sociopath, and then I started crying.
Yeah, and I said just because you like Sherlock doesn't mean you're a sociopath.
So I guess that's null and void then, because I started crying, which is emotion in a movie. What you're talking about is this unhealthy toxic spiral that starts to happen. So the interesting part is when you don't deal with a toxic shame, which often we don't because we don't know how. No one's coached us on how to do that. And oftentimes we don't know what it is because we just believe we're not good enough. It goes down this rabbit hole, and it can come with a lot of really serious consequences. Like it can lead to a lot of things. So it can lead to addiction is a really big one. So alcohol, drugs, depression, not thinking that you want to be here, like life's not worth fighting for anymore. And what's really interesting in the book I was reading, they gave an example about how it's the most unbearable form of pain. Because if you have pain, say you have a toothache, right? It's super painful, unbearable. You can go to a dentist. You can get it removed. You can use Oragel. You can numb it. You can do all of these things to alleviate the pain. But when you believe that you're fundamentally flawed, there's nothing that heals that, which is why it gets dangerous so quickly.
Yeah, well, it's interesting that you say that because Brene cites that the current neuroscience shows that the pain and feelings of rejection that shame inflicts are as real as physical pain.
Right.
And so our bodies respond the same to shame as they do to physical pain.
Right.
But like you're saying, physical pain, you can at least do something to alleviate it, whereas emotional pain and feelings of shame, it's not as easy to remedy.
And because you can't do that, people often look for a mood interferer. That's not a word. Something that interferes with your mood because it takes you out of that moment. So if you get really, really drunk, you're not feeling those feelings. You're not there. So that's why that becomes the go-to coping skill, which is what leads to addiction.
So it's interesting because they identified that one of the most primary elicitors of shame is unwanted identity. And
Say more about that.
what they identify as unwanted identities are characteristics that undermine our vision of our ideal selves. So,
What's an example of that?
well, so the example that Brene gives in the book is she was always taught growing up that if you're sick, you're weak. That if you ever get sick, that it's a sign of weakness, and we don't get sick in this household.
You just push through it.
You just push through it.
That
and
sounds
so
familiar.
she had a lot of shame around ever being sick because that was not the ideal vision of herself that she wanted. And so that was accompanied by shame.
Yeah. The other interesting spot where shame shows up is in relationships. So we've talked about how it can lead to things such as addiction, which again, the reason we bring that up is for awareness. Like if you struggle with coping in a way that isn't necessarily healthy, no judgment whatsoever, but just bringing that awareness to say, why am I doing this? Like, where is this coming from? And what am I trying to numb or run away from? So in relationships, it's interesting because it says lack of intimacy is the number one display of toxic shame showing up. So toxic shame is the number one form of a gap in intimacy. And it makes sense because when it starts to list out some of the things that show up in the relationship, it definitely explains why there would be a disconnect in intimacy. So some of the things that the book talks about is criticism. So being critical of yourself or your partner, having self-esteem issues, having control issues. And then the biggest one, which I know very well, and I'm not sure that we've talked about this yet, is projection. So projecting all of the above onto your significant other when really it's your own shame and your own issues that you need to deal with.
Yeah, Brene talks about that as well in her book.
Yeah. Have we talked about projection?
I don't
Does
think
everyone know
so.
what that is?
I don't think so. You
So-
can go ahead and explain it.
I don't really know how, but the best way I know how to explain it is that you are projecting your own issues onto someone else. So think of a projector and you put it up on the screen. I'm the projector, the other person is the screen. So because I haven't dealt with my struggles and my issues, I'm automatically putting them on you, assuming you're doing those things or you're the problem. Or
So what's an example of that, like a real life example that you would see projection coming out?
an example would be if I had a fear that you were going to cheat on me, that
Okay.
you were going to have an affair with someone. I'm so convinced, even though you've never given me any indication that I have anything to worry about, you've always been loyal, I am dead set that you are going to cheat on me. Projection would be I'm actually the one that has engaged in cheating before or had an affair. So because I engaged in it, I'm projecting onto you that
Got
you're
it.
automatically going to engage in that behavior.
Got it.
So going back to relationships, projection is so dangerous, especially if you're dealing with toxic shame, because you can take everything you're feeling on the inside, and if you don't know how to deal with it yourself and own it, you can put all of that onto the other person, which is going to destroy your relationship in a heartbeat.
Well, it's interesting because when you talk about not dealing with your stuff, Brene talks about it in that, like, it doesn't just go nowhere. Like when you bottle things up, it's all jam packed down until it finally explodes. And that can come in anger bouts, or as you talked about earlier, shame is positively correlated with anxiety, depression, aggression, eating disorders, and bullying.
Because it comes out and it's kind of like big emotions. If you
Yeah.
don't deal with them, they're going to come out in the most
Exactly.
unexpected ways.
Exactly. And so the interesting thing, though, is because earlier we differentiated between shame and guilt. Guilt is negatively correlated with all those things. So that's that speaks to guilt is actually a healthy emotion that keeps us in line with our values, so that our behavior is in alignment and it's congruent with what we believe. Whereas shame is the opposite. Shame actually breaks down who we are and what we think of ourselves, and then it results in things like I just listed.
Right. So I think we should talk a little bit we've talked about what shame is, how it shows up, what it can lead to if it's not dealt with. So I think it would be really important to talk about what some of those processes look like for healing and working through it. Like if you hear this and you think, oh my goodness, I might have some issues going on with shame, we're just going to go through the 10,000 foot view of some ideas of what you can do. Obviously, I would recommend talking to a counselor or going to therapy if you felt like it was a deeper level that you needed to work through. That's what I did, and I uncovered a lot, and I was able to work through a lot. So again, coming back to that community, whether that's a therapist or your friend group of people that you trust and you can start to be vulnerable with, definitely that's something to consider too.
Yeah, and I think one more note on identifying if you're in shame. I hear it a lot when people let little pieces of their self-talk out. If they make a mistake and they go, "Oh, Beth, you're so stupid. Why did you do that?" Like that is shame, because you made a mistake and you immediately correlated that with you actually being dumb rather than you being a human and simply not perfect. You've now associated that with you have a character flaw and you're stupid. What do we do if you're listening to this and you're like, "Uh-oh, I think I might have shame because I have some of these thoughts," whether that's around setting boundaries or, your performance at work or your value as a partner or a parent. What do we do when we suddenly think, "Uh-oh, I think I'm in shame"?
The number one thing that Brene says and that John Bradshaw says is you have to shine light on it.
Yeah.
And what I appreciate about Brene is how she calls them shame gremlins.
I was going to say, you like the movie Gremlins.
I just freaking love gremlins. I remember I was talking to a friend about this and I was like, I said shame gremlins from Brene and she's like, Oh my God, gremlins are so great. And so we have this joke now that when shame shows up, we picture this little gremlin in the corner and how we need to get rid of it. And then we joke about water and then multiplying and eating after midnight. But anyway, Brene says you have to shine light on it. And that's also what John says, that you have to come out of hiding by going into social contact, which means honestly sharing your feelings with people that are in your inner circle, because the more you hide it, it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. But then once you shine light on it and you address it, you can work through it.
Yeah, so Brene talks about this a lot, that what you're talking about, shining light in the gremlin. She says the less that we talk about shame, the more control it has over us. And the three ingredients it needs to grow and take even more control over us is secrecy, silence, and judgment. And
so like water, food after midnight, like traditional gremlins, it's very similar.
yeah, that's a strong correlation. Yeah. So, and I think one of the things that they both identify in the books is that shame happens between people. And so it needs to heal between people. So for me, this is something that if I identify that I'm feeling shame, I would much rather just like be by myself and deal with it.
Right.
But per the protocol, doesn't really work like that, because shame, you have to sort it out with someone else.
Well, and it takes so much courage, right? Like I think about how we preach to the choir about setting boundaries, and setting boundaries takes work and takes courage as well. But if I think about if I'd rather set a boundary or have a conversation with someone that they made me feel shame, sometimes those two overlap. Like sometimes that is what's happening. But that makes me sweat a little bit. Like that's the ultimate form of courage.
For sure. Brene identifies a 4-step. The first step is recognizing a shame trigger, recognizing that like, oh, the emotion I'm feeling right now is shame and this is what's triggering it. The second step is to reality check the messages and expectations that tell us that being imperfect means being inadequate. And then the third is to share, like you said, share your story with people you trust. And then the fourth is to talk about shame and ask for what you need.
Yeah. And I think the only other things, a lot of his points overlap those. So the second one is seeing ourselves mirrored and echoed in the eyes of at least one non-shaming person. So looking at it through the lens of someone who doesn't make you feel shame, and they can bring perspective to it through their lens of what's happening. So an example of that would be if I came to you and I'm like, this situation happened and I'm feeling like this is making me feel shame. You have an external lens that you can bring clarity to the situation to say, oh yeah, that might have been shame, or no, that wasn't shame.
Yeah, and this kind of reminds me a little bit of how we talk about reframing, or you like to talk about this a lot, emotion versus logic.
Yeah.
And so I think that's kind of what Brene is alluding to with the reality check between the messages. And so going to someone externally to say, here's what I'm feeling. Can you help me bring the logic back into this?
Exactly.
And Brene talks about how the antidote to shame is empathy. And so when she says both her and the doctor in your book, Dr. John, what they both say is that going to someone else who can help you see yourself from an outside perspective, that is empathy.
Yeah.
Right. So to have a non-judging person say, like breathing truth into your feelings of inadequacy is really helpful.
Yeah. You're not a bad person. You have this moment. You're struggling with this, but that doesn't make you a bad person.
Right.
So the other things he recommends are learning to say, I love myself for. That way you are making a decision to accept all parts of yourself unconditionally. And I had to do a lot of work with this one. Like I had to reframe my stop being an idiot, or like, what the hell are you doing, to, wow, you take a very unique path to accomplishing things sometimes, but that makes you eclectic and fun. Sometimes it makes work challenging, but this is also a really cool part of who you are. And you would reaffirm that when I was going through a really tough time and feeling really down on myself and like I was flawed when I was going through all of the shame work and counseling. You're like, this is what you see, but this is what other people see. Right. And this is what makes you so special and unique.
Well, and self-compassion self-compassion that is a huge part of this whole process, right?
Yeah.
Because you can't work yourself out of shame if you're not being compassionate with yourself. And that's also, if you're having a hard time getting to that self-compassion, having that empathy person will help you kind of bring perspective so that you can practice self-compassion with yourself.
Yeah. So the second to last thing actually plays really well into that, externalizing the voice in your head. So these voices keep our shame spirals in operation. So when we do the exercise to stop our shaming voices and learn to replace them with new, nurturing, and positive voices, that's reframing and self-compassion. And we talk a lot about those in our course that's coming out in March. We will link the details. The wait list is starting to fill up. It's super exciting.
Yeah.
But we really talk about how powerful the compassionate self-talk and the reframe is. Like those two tools alone, once you start to master them, it completely changes your life and it shuts down the shame and the negative critic inside.
Totally.
The last one he says is just learning how to handle your mistakes and having the courage to be imperfect. So we
Yes.
talked about how perfection is a dark, dark demon and how it relates big into shame. And so really just giving yourself that ability to say, I'm not perfect and there's nothing wrong with that.
So a final note on that, you brought perfectionism back around. And I just wanted to draw attention to the distinction that Brene makes between healthy striving and perfectionism, because sometimes I think that when we talk about perfectionism, not chasing perfectionism doesn't mean not chasing excellence.
There's a difference.
Yeah. So she says that healthy striving is self-focused. How can I improve? But perfectionism is other-focused. What will they think?
Ooh, that's
so
powerful.
I think that is very helpful. A lot of this stuff can get really sticky if you don't know how to identify what you're feeling when. And so I think it's really helpful to have those kind of simple clarifiers. Like, am I beating myself up over this mistake because I wanted to be better? Or is it because of what others will think when they see the mistake or find out about it?
That separates it very clearly. Like, I feel like
Yeah.
we should make that a quote or take that quote from Brene and put it somewhere and
With due
post
credit.
it to
Yeah.
share because that way at a quick glance, you can kind of do a really fast self-check.
Well, and that's kind of like the basis of our course too, is to kind of give you these tools to say, like, you may have heard these terms kind of vaguely throughout your life, but here's what it means, here's how to identify it, and here's how to overcome it.
Right, for sure.
So, well, it's been fantastic getting back at it. I had fun.
I had fun too.
I mean, I never thought I'd say that I had fun talking about shame.
I
but,
thought we did it in a perfectly fun way.
I mean,
I think we're passionate about teaching others.
Yeah.
That's probably what's happening.
well, because we nerd out when we get the research books out and our notes and
Yeah.
and whatnot. So as we always say, take what's helpful, leave the rest. We hope you enjoyed this. We hope that you got something from it. And if you have any questions or you're just kind of wondering what to do next, feel free to shoot us a message. We'd love to hear from you over on our social channels at Life with Beth and Court or on our website at the show notes, lifewithbethandcourt.com. And until we talk to you next week, keep building your best life.
Bye, guys.